March 1945. The morning sun cuts through the low clouds above the Rhine River near Viersen, casting long shadows across the German countryside. High above, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot adjusts his camera, peering down at what appears to be the most massive American armored buildup of the entire war. Hundreds of Sherman tanks glisten in the pale light, their steel hulls arranged in perfect formation across the muddy fields. Convoy after convoy of trucks rolls along the country roads, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Radio chatter fills the airwaves as American commanders coordinate what looks like the final assault on Hitler's last line of defense. The German pilot banks his Messerschmitt, circling for another pass. Below him, he counts tank after tank, artillery piece after artillery piece. This has to be General Omar Bradley's entire 12th Army Group, preparing for a massive crossing near Düsseldorf. He snaps photograph after photograph, his heart racing with the importance of his discovery. The intelligence officers back at headquarters will want to see this immediately. This is it. The moment they have been preparing for. The final American push across the Rhine. But as the pilot wings his way back to German lines, carrying what he believes to be the most crucial intelligence of the war, he has no idea that he has just witnessed one of the greatest magic tricks in military history. None of it was real. What the Germans saw was a mirage, a masterpiece of deception created not by warriors, but by artists. The story begins more than a year earlier in the quiet halls of the Pentagon, where military planners faced an impossible challenge. How do you fool an entire army? How do you make the enemy see what isn't there while hiding what is? The answer came from an unlikely source, the British, who had already proven that deception could be as powerful as any weapon. Their Operation Fortitude had convinced Hitler that D-Day would come at Calais, not Normandy, saving countless Allied lives on the beaches of France. American military leaders realized they needed their own masters of illusion. On January 20th, 1944, at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the United States Army officially activated one of the most unusual units in military history, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. On paper, it looked like any other military formation, 1,100 soldiers organized into companies and battalions. But this was no ordinary Army unit. This was America's Ghost Army. Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a career officer with a reputation for innovative thinking, took command of this strange new formation. His executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Clifford C. Higgins, helped him understand that traditional military training would not be enough for what they were being asked to do. These soldiers would fight not with rifles and grenades, but with creativity and cunning. Their battlefield would be the human mind, and their weapons would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The recruitment process broke every rule in the military handbook. Instead of seeking hardened infantry veterans or experienced tank crews, the Army sent recruiters to art schools and design studios. They wanted painters and sculptors, sound engineers and radio technicians, set designers and architects. They raided the halls of Yale and the Pratt Institute, pulling students from their easels and drafting tables. They visited Hollywood studios, recruiting the artists who had created movie magic on silver screens across America. Among those who answered the call was Bill Blass, a young fashion designer whose eye for detail would prove invaluable in creating convincing military illusions. Ellsworth Kelly, destined to become one of America's most celebrated painters, found himself trading his brushes for inflatable tanks. Arthur Shillstone, a talented illustrator, discovered that his artistic skills had military applications he had never imagined. These men represented the Army's boldest experiment, the idea that creativity could be weaponized as effectively as any conventional armament. The unit boasted one of the highest collective IQs in the entire Army, averaging 119 soldier. But intelligence points per alone would not be enough. These artists had to learn designers to think like soldiers, to understand military tactics and enemy psychology. More importantly, they had to master 3 revolutionary technologies that would become the foundation of modern military deception. The first weapon in their arsenal was visual illusion on a scale never before attempted. The centerpiece was the inflatable M4 Sherman tank, a marvel of engineering disguised as military equipment. These were not simple balloons that could be punctured by a single piece of shrapnel. Each dummy tank consisted of a sophisticated skeleton of pressurized rubber tubes covered with rubberized canvas. The design ensured that damage to one section would not immediately deflate the entire structure. When fully inflated, these fake Shermans measured 18 feet 4 inches long, 8 feet 3 inches wide, and 7 feet 9 inches to the top of the turret. It took exactly 20 minutes to inflate each tank using gasoline-powered air compressors. The turret was a separate piece that inflated independently before being attached to the main body. Every detail had been carefully considered, from the authentic paint schemes to the realistic shadows cast in daylight. From 500 feet above, German reconnaissance pilots could not distinguish these inflatable decoys from actual Sherman tanks. But the Ghost Army's arsenal extended far beyond fake tanks. They carried inflatable jeeps, artillery pieces, and even aircraft. Each piece was crafted with the same attention to detail that movie studios brought to their most elaborate sets. Teams of artists worked continuously to maintain the illusion, touching up paint, adjusting positions, and adding realistic battle damage to make the equipment look authentically weathered. The second weapon was even more innovative: audio deception. The Ghost Army's sound engineers had developed massive 500-pound speakers capable of projecting recorded sounds over distances of up to 15 miles. These were not ordinary recordings. Teams of specialists had spent months capturing the authentic sounds of military operations. They recorded Sherman tank engines starting up, convoy trucks grinding through mud, construction equipment building bridges, and thousands of soldiers going about their daily routines. The recordings were masterpieces of audio engineering. Sound technicians mixed different elements to create the impression of specific military activities. They could simulate the sound of an armored division preparing for battle, complete with the rumble of tank engines, the clank of treads, and the voices of commanders shouting orders. They could recreate the audio signature of engineers building pontoon bridges, with the splash of equipment hitting water and the mechanical sounds of construction machinery. These massive speakers could be positioned miles from the actual Ghost Army soldiers, projecting sounds that would convince posts that major military operations were underway in areas where only a handful of artists operated their inflatable props. The psychological impact was enormous. German intelligence officers, trained to recognize the audio signatures of different American units, found themselves tracking divisions that existed only in sound waves. The third, and perhaps most sophisticated weapon, was radio deception. The Ghost Army's communications specialists were masters of electronic impersonation. They studied the radio procedures and communication styles of real American divisions, learning to mimic everything from call signs to the personal quirks of individual radio operators. Their transmissions were so convincing that German intelligence accepted them as authentic reports from actual military units. These radio operators worked in perfect coordination with the visual and audio deception teams. When inflatable tanks were positioned in a new location, radio transmissions would begin emanating from the same area, reporting unit movements and supply requirements that matched what German intelligence would expect from a real armored division. The radio chatter included mundane details like meal schedules and equipment maintenance, the kind of routine communications that made the deception completely believable. The combination of visual, audio, and radio deception created a complete sensory illusion. German reconnaissance could see the tanks, hear the engines, and intercept the radio transmissions. Every piece of intelligence confirmed the others, building an unshakable conviction that major American forces were operating in areas where only a few dozen Ghost Army soldiers actually worked. By the summer of 1944, the Ghost Army had completed their training and crossed the English Channel into France. Their first taste of combat deception came during the breakout from Normandy, when real American divisions needed to disappear from German intelligence while repositioning for major offensives. The artists found themselves working under conditions they had never imagined during their comfortable training sessions in Tennessee. The muddy fields of France were nothing like the movie sets where some had learned their turncraft. Run their carefully painted inflatable tanks into slippery, unwieldy monsters that required teams of men to position correctly. German artillery shells screamed overhead while they worked, and the constant threat of Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights meant every detail had to be perfect. A single mistake, a shadow falling the wrong way, a piece of equipment positioned incorrectly, could expose the entire operation and cost thousands of American lives. Arthur Shillstone, the talented illustrator who had traded his commercial art career for this strange military assignment, found himself crawling through French hedgerows at dawn, touching up paint on inflatable jeeps, while real German snipers operated less than a mile away. The irony was not lost on him that his artistic training, which had taught him to observe light and shadow with obsessive precision, now served to fool enemy photographers flying overhead at 10,000 feet. Their first major test came during the siege of Brest, the heavily fortified German port on the Brittany Peninsula. Real American forces were preparing to assault the fortress city, but military planners wanted the Germans to believe the attack would come from the east rather than the west. The Ghost Army was given 48 hours to create the illusion of an entire armored division massing for assault in completely the wrong location. Working through the night, teams of artists inflated hundreds of dummy tanks and positioned them in fields visible from German observation posts. Sound engineers placed their massive speakers in concealed positions, broadcasting the recorded sounds of tank maintenance, fuel trucks, and hundreds of soldiers preparing for battle. Radio operators began transmitting authentic-sounding communications between fictional tank commanders and imaginary supply officers. The deception worked flawlessly. German defenders shifted their artillery to cover the false threat, weakening their defenses against the real American attack. When Brest finally fell after weeks of brutal fighting, German prisoners revealed that their intelligence officers had been completely convinced by the Ghost Army's illusion. They had tracked every movement of the fictional armored division, never suspecting that it existed only in rubber and radio waves. But these early operations were merely rehearsals for the greatest challenge of the war. By March 1945, Allied forces had fought their way across France, through Belgium, and into Germany itself. They now stood at the banks of the Rhine River, Hitler's last major natural barrier. Beyond the river lay the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany, the factories and cities that powered the Third Reich's war machine. The Rhine crossing would be the largest Allied operation since D-Day, involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands of vehicles. But success depended on achieving tactical surprise. If German forces could mass their reserves at the crossing point, they might inflict catastrophic casualties on the attacking Americans and British. The Germans had to be fooled about where the crossing would occur, and they had to be fooled completely. Colonel Harry L. Reeder received his orders in early March. The real crossing would take place near the towns of Ries and Wesel, where the 9th U.S. Army and British forces would storm across the river in overwhelming strength. But German intelligence had to believe the main assault would come 30 miles south near. Army would simulate Dusseldorf. The Ghost, not just one division, but two entire for the largest divisions preparing infantry river crossing operation of the war. Operation Viersen began on March 18, 1945. Under cover of darkness, Ghost Army soldiers moved into position along the Rhine south of Dusseldorf. They carried with them the most elaborate deception equipment ever assembled: hundreds of inflatable tanks, dozens of fake artillery pieces, dummy aircraft, and enough radio equipment to simulate the communications network of 30,000 soldiers. The scale of the operation dwarfed everything they had attempted before. Teams worked through the night, inflating tank after tank in perfect military formation. Each dummy Sherman was positioned with mathematical precision, creating the visual signature that German reconnaissance would expect from a real armored spearhead. Artists crawled through the mud, painting realistic battle damage and adjusting camouflage nets to create authentic shadows. Victor Dowd, a commercial artist from New York who had become one of the unit's most skilled camouflage specialists, supervised teams painting identification markings on the inflatable vehicles. Every tank bore the correct unit insignia. Every jeep displayed appropriate bumper numbers. German intelligence officers studying reconnaissance photographs would find exactly the details they expected to see from the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. The sound deception was even more ambitious. Engineers positioned their 500-pound speakers at carefully calculated intervals along the riverbank, creating overlapping fields of audio illusion that extended for miles. The recordings they played had been mixed specifically for this operation, combining the sounds of pontoon bridge construction with the rumble of hundreds of tanks moving into assault positions. The audio track was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. German listening posts could hear the distinctive whine of American engineer equipment, the splash of bridge sections hitting water, and the voices of American commanders coordinating the massive operation. Sound engineers had even included the audio signatures of specific equipment types, the particular engine note of Sherman tanks, the hydraulic whir of tank recovery vehicles, the diesel rumble of supply trucks. Radio operators worked in shifts around the clock, maintaining the communications network of two fictional divisions. Their transmissions were indistinguishable from authentic military traffic, complete with proper call signs, realistic equipment requests, and the mundane administrative chatter that characterized real military operations. German intelligence intercepted hundreds of messages detailing everything from ammunition requirements to medical evacuation procedures. The psychological pressure on the Ghost Army soldiers was enormous. They knew that thousands of real American and British soldiers were depending on their deception. If German reinforcements rushed to defend Dusseldorf instead of the actual crossing sites, the Rhine operation would succeed with minimal casualties. If the deception failed, the river crossing could become a bloodbath that might extend the war by months. For 5 days, the illusion held. German reconnaissance flights photographed the dummy equipment repeatedly, each sortie confirming the intelligence picture of massive American preparations near Dusseldorf. Artillery spotters reported the sounds of bridge construction and tank movements. Radio intercept stations logged hundreds of transmissions from the fictional divisions. German High Command responded exactly as Allied planners had hoped. Reserve divisions were moved south to defend against the expected assault near Dusseldorf. Artillery was repositioned to cover the false threat. Tank destroyers and anti-aircraft guns were concentrated in areas where no real Americans would appear. On March 23rd, while German attention remained focused on the Ghost Army's elaborate theater performance, the real Rhine crossing began 30 miles to the north. The 9th U.S. Army and British XXX Corps stormed across the river at Ries and Wesel, encountering resistance far lighter than military planners had dared hope. The Germans had been caught completely off guard, their reserves committed to defending against an attack that would never come. The crossing succeeded beyond all expectations. Within 24 hours, Allied forces had established bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Within a week, they had broken through German defensive lines and were racing toward the heart of Nazi Germany. The war in Europe would end just 6 weeks later, with Berlin in ruins and Hitler dead in his bunker. But even as real Allied armies poured across the Rhine, the Ghost Army continued their deception. German intelligence still believed the Dusseldorf crossing was imminent, still tracked the movements of fictional divisions, still intercepted radio transmissions from units that existed only in the minds of American artists. The illusion was so complete, so thoroughly convincing, that some German commanders continued to expect the phantom attack, even after the real war had ended. The success at the Rhine represented the culmination of everything the Ghost Army had learned about the psychology of deception. But the human cost of maintaining such elaborate illusions took its toll on the men who lived double lives behind enemy lines. For Arthur Singer, a commercial artist from Philadelphia who had become one of the unit's most skilled camouflage painters, the pressure was becoming unbearable. Every morning he would crawl through German-occupied territory, touching up paint on inflatable equipment while knowing that a single mistake could expose the entire operation. Singer had developed an almost supernatural ability to read light and shadow, understanding exactly how German reconnaissance cameras would interpret the scenes he created. He would spend hours adjusting the position of a single dummy Jeep, ensuring that its shadow fell precisely where a real vehicle's shadow should. The attention to detail was obsessive, because German photo analysts were trained professionals who could spot inconsistencies that would escape casual observation. A bumper number positioned incorrectly, a camouflage net draped at the wrong angle, equipment that looked too new or too clean. Any of these details could unravel months of careful preparation. Victor Dowd, the New York commercial artist who had become the unit's leading expert on military vehicle identification markings, faced similar pressures. German intelligence maintained detailed files on American unit insignia and tactical markings. Every tank bore specific numbers and symbols that indicated its battalion, company, and individual identity within the military hierarchy. Dowd had memorized hundreds of authentic marking patterns, and his teams worked through the night applying correct insignia to inflatable equipment. The work required steady hands and perfect precision, often performed in complete darkness to avoid detection by German observation posts. The psychological strain extended beyond the technical challenges. These men lived in constant fear of discovery, knowing that if captured while operating their deception equipment, they could be executed as spies rather than treated as prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention offered limited protection to soldiers engaged in such elaborate deception operations. German forces had already demonstrated their willingness to execute captured commandos and special operations personnel. The Ghost Army soldiers understood that their artistic talents had placed them in a uniquely dangerous position, yet the results spoke for themselves. German intelligence reports from March 1945 reveal the complete success of Operation Viersen. Intercepted communications show that Wehrmacht commanders were convinced they faced two full American divisions preparing for a massive river crossing near Düsseldorf. Reserve tank destroyers were moved south from their positions near the real crossing sites. Artillery batteries were repositioned to cover the phantom threat. Even elite Waffen-SS units were diverted to defend against an attack allies. The deception succeeded that would never matter because it appealed to German military logic. Düsseldorf was exactly where military doctrine suggested the Americans should cross. The terrain favored offensive operations. The road network could support massive supply convoys, and the city's industrial facilities made it a strategically valuable objective. When German reconnaissance confirmed the presence of major American forces in the area, it merely validated what their staff officers had already concluded through conventional military analysis. The Ghost Army's radio deception added layers of authenticity that made the illusion impossible to doubt. Communications specialists had spent months studying the radio procedures of real American divisions, learning not just the technical aspects of military communications, but the personal quirks and speech patterns of individual operators. German intercept stations had files on American radio personnel, recognizing operators by their distinctive transmission styles. The Ghost Army's communications teams could imitate these personal characteristics so precisely that German intelligence never questioned the authenticity of their transmissions. Lieutenant Jack Macy, a young soldier from Chicago who had trained as a commercial artist before the war, found himself responsible for coordinating the visual elements of the deception with the radio transmissions. When dummy tanks were moved to new positions, Macy ensured that radio traffic would reflect the movement, with fictional tank commanders reporting their new locations and requesting fuel and ammunition resupply. The coordination was so precise that German intelligence could track individual vehicles through both visual observation and radio intercepts, never realizing they were following inflatable decoys guided by artists. The sound deception reached unprecedented levels of sophistication during Operation Viersen. Engineers had recorded not just the mechanical sounds of military equipment, but the human sounds of army life. German listening posts could hear American soldiers talking, laughing, arguing, and going about their daily routines. The recordings included authentic regional accents and military slang, creating an audio landscape that was indistinguishable from a real military encampment. Technical Sergeant Charles Williams, a sound engineer from Detroit who had worked in broadcasting before joining the Ghost Army, supervised teams that operated the massive speakers around the clock. The equipment required constant maintenance in the harsh conditions near the Rhine, where rain and mud threatened to destroy sensitive electronics. Williams and his men worked in shifts, ensuring that the audio deception never faltered, even when German artillery shells landed dangerously close to their concealed positions. The speakers themselves were marvels of wartime engineering. Each unit weighed 500 pounds and required its own generator for power. They could project clear, recognizable sounds over distances of 15 miles, creating the acoustic signature of major military operations in areas where only a handful of Ghost Army soldiers actually worked. The psychological impact on German forces was enormous, as they could hear what sounded like thousands of American soldiers preparing for battle just beyond their defensive positions. As the real Rhine crossing began on March 23rd, the Ghost Army maintained their deception with unwavering dedication. German forces continued to expect the phantom attack near Dusseldorf, keeping precious reserves away from the actual battle. Artillery that could have devastated the real river crossing remained pointed at empty fields, where inflatable tanks sat motionless in the morning mist. Tank destroyers and anti-aircraft guns stayed concentrated against a threat that existed only in rubber and radio waves. The Ghost Army's mission remained classified for 51 years. These men returned home as anonymous veterans, carrying secrets they could never share. Their wives never knew why they sometimes stared silently at art museums. Their children never understood why their fathers smiled strangely at war movies. Bill Blass became a fashion icon, Ellsworth Kelly a celebrated painter, Arthur Shillstone a renowned illustrator. But none could speak of their greatest masterpiece. Only in 1996, when military historians finally declassified their records, did the world learn the truth. The artists who had saved thousands of lives, who had shortened the war, who had turned creativity into the ultimate weapon, could finally tell their stories. By then, many had passed away, taking their memories of rubber tanks and phantom armies to their graves. In 2022, the surviving members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops received the Congressional Gold Medal, America's highest civilian honor. They were old men by then, in their 90s, but their eyes still sparkled with the mischief of artists who had fooled Hitler's entire war machine. They didn't fight with bullets or bombs, but with brushes, speakers, and air pumps. Their battlefield was the human mind, and in that arena, they were unbeatable. The Ghost Army proved that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying the enemy, but from making them see what isn't there while hiding what is. In a war defined by industrial slaughter, these artists reminded the world that imagination can triumph over brute force.